is wonderful to be with you all, and thank you for your prayers to arrange the weather. It's been an amazing day. My wife and I have had a wonderful day traipsing around your fair city. So tonight, what Mark asked me to do was to share a little bit about how we accomplished what surprised the heck out of me in early 2021, abolishing the death penalty. I thought that would be year 2 of a 5 or 6 year campaign. And I was quite stunned that, thanks to the Holy Spirit, everything came together in a remarkable way over the course of about 12 to 15 weeks. And we were able to end the evil of capital punishment in Virginia, becoming the first Southern state to do so. And so I was asked to come and to share a little bit about how we accomplished that, and also to talk about some spiritual lessons that I learned being part of the death penalty abolition movement. So the first point I want to raise is that we are dealing with a profound evil when we talk about the death penalty, because we are talking about the intentional killing of a human being. It is a terrible crime and a sin against God's created order. For those of you how many here have suffered the death of a loved one? That is incredibly difficult, the loss of a mother, the loss of a child, the loss of a sibling. It's compounded if it is sudden, like a traffic accident, crossing the street, getting hit by a bus. That adds to the trauma. What adds to the trauma even more is if that is violence that is intentionally directed against your loved one by another human being. That your trauma is probably magnified by a couple orders of magnitude. And that is the reason why there is such a strong and visceral desire to exact vengeance on perpetrators. And so when we talk about, as advocates, we have to recognize that evil and recognize that trauma as our starting point. Because if we don't, we come off as being these namby-pamby, naive people who don't understand the evil that operates in our world. So I think that's a very, very, very important starting point for anybody who's an advocate, to be very sober about this, and that we are talking about one of the most profoundly difficult things that any human being can endure in this life. But the question is, how do we as a society respond to that trauma? And I believe what we're called to is what Dorothy Day calls a harsh and dreadful love. Dorothy Day was a remarkable woman in the 1930s who organized, mostly in the Catholic spaces, during the heights of the Great Depression, saying that truly following Christ in love is not pretty, and it is profoundly difficult. And I think when we're talking in the death penalty space, we are also talking about a harsh and dreadful love that we are called to follow. So the modern era of the death penalty, the US Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty in 1972 in a case called Furman versus Georgia, and they did it for 2 primary reasons. Number one, there was wild inconsistency in punishment, and there was no clear distinction between capital murder and non-capital murder in most state laws. And the other was the profound racial disparities in the implementation of the death penalty. So 4 years later, in Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court allowed the resumption of the death penalty. And they tried to do so to try to remedy the previous problems. And they do so in a 2-stage trial process In a capital murder trial, there are actually two trials. The first is to establish guilt or innocence. And if guilty, then there is an entire second trial that happens where the jury is to weigh aggravating versus mitigating circumstances. So that's just context, because when we talk about capital punishment, we talk basically about pre-Furman and post-Furman. And they're two very distinct eras in US death penalty history. So, executions since the beginning of the Republic. Virginia carried out the first recorded execution in what is the New World in 1608, 1 year after the founding of Jamestown, with the execution of a captain for being a spy on behalf of Spain. So that was the first documented execution by Europeans in this New World. And so in our entire history of Virginia, we carried out 1,390 documented executions, more than any other state, including Texas, though Texas is rapidly gaining on us and will probably overtake us with time. And then Louisiana is number 10 in terms of formal executions, 632 prior to Furman, and then 28 in the modern era. Since 1976, again, Virginia was a number 2 for a long time, but because we were able to slow the wheels in Virginia and then ultimately abolish, Oklahoma has overtaken us. And Louisiana is in 13th place among the states that have carried out executions in the modern era. Now, the geography of the death penalty. This is old data, several years old, but it gives the point that the death penalty is overwhelmingly a southern phenomenon. You can see Texas alone, but that if you look at all the executions in the Midwest, West, and Northeast combined, it is far less than half of just Texas alone. Now, one of the things that Mark told me about, my wife and I were sightseers earlier today in Jackson Square, and it is an absolutely beautiful place. But one of the things you may not know about Jackson Square, that it was a notorious execution site in the 18th and 19th centuries, known as the Place des Armes. And following the German Coast Uprising, the country's largest slave revolt, 3 slaves were hanged at the square, and their heads were put on the city's gates as a warning against any other further slave revolts. So just a little bit of history for Jackson Square. Now today, Louisiana, the death penalty. If the data that I saw on the Death Penalty Information Center website is correct, there are currently 63 people on death row here in Louisiana, 28 executions in the modern era, and that 12 people who were sentenced to death here in Louisiana were later to be found innocent. And that, I think, might be the nation's largest number. If not, it's close with Florida, I think. But that is a remarkable number. In Virginia, we just had 1 documented death row exoneration. And there probably would have been more, but we were so damn efficient and quick between death sentences and executions, there wasn't time to really prove innocence, if that was the case. And certainly quite a few executions in Virginia where there were lots and lots of very serious questions about whether the person executed actually was innocent. So I'm going to run through very quickly the 4 most important arguments against capital punishment in the United States. The first is a very clear history of targeting African Americans. So this is a list of all the post-bellum lynchings of African Americans in the United States. And you can see Louisiana was 3rd in the number of documented, again, documented, There were many more lynchings that have never really received any kind of documentation in a local newspaper or any other place. But of the ones that have been documented, you were third, rather close third behind Mississippi and Georgia. And you can see Virginia was amazingly small, the smallest number of lynchings in the South. And that's for one reason. In Virginia, we had something called the rocket docket, where someone could be arrested for a crime, tried within a matter of weeks, and then executed within another week. And that was common in Virginia, and it was done explicitly as a way to keep lynchings from happening. That law enforcement officials, when mobs would form, would say, look, justice will be carried out, just give us a couple weeks, and you'll see the SOB swing. But well, let's do it legal-like. And so it was a legal veneer. So what I called in Virginia for well over a century, we had what I would consider to be legal lynchings. Now, this is a really interesting graphic I found online of all the lynchings and racial massacres that took place post-bellum here in Louisiana. And it's really quite remarkable. 215 carried out in Bossier and Caddo parishes in 1868. 2 massacres in Colfax and Grant Parish, 156 African Americans killed. 200 in Opelousas in 1868, and on and on and on. So the reason why I talk about lynchings, I want you to look at these 2 maps. The top map are the documented lynchings that have taken place in the United States. The one below it are the ones of legal executions in the modern era. Do you see a pattern? Overwhelmingly, the places where lynchings were common is where legal executions took place subsequently. And also, again, overwhelmingly in the Mid-Atlantic and South is for the vast majority of those lynchings and executions. Now, 76, the new order was supposed to solve the problem of racial disparities in executions. But what it did was just do a peculiar flip. In Virginia, at least, prior to Furman, the most reliable indicator of whether someone was going to be executed or not was the skin color of the perpetrator on trial. Post-Furman, the most reliable indicator was the color of the victim. I once did some research. Virginia executed 1,370 people until the first white person was executed for killing a black person in Virginia. And of the 1,390 executions, of the ones I could find, there were only 3 executions of white people for killing 1 or more African Americans. In contrast, you can see these are nationwide figures as of about 6 years ago. Nationwide, there were 20 white defendants executed for killing black victims, but 288 black defendants executed for killing white victims. Now, again, racial disparities are different post-Furman, but they still exist. Cases, again, here with white victims, especially with black suspects, are far more likely to lead to harsher outcomes, including executions. Homicides where a black male suspect and a white female victim were more than 5 times as likely to lead to a capital charge or death sentence. And homicides with black suspects and white victims were 11% of Louisiana homicides, but made up 41% of all death sentences in Louisiana. So, clear pattern of racial discrimination pre and post Furman in application of capital punishment. The second key argument is that it doesn't work. It is not a deterrent. This is very curious. This is an engraving of an execution in 1747. It depicts the execution of a pickpocket, and in the photo is the picture of a pickpocket picking pockets at that execution of a pickpocket. I mean, if there was not a more ironic demonstration that the death penalty does not work as a deterrent, you can just look at this almost, gosh, how old is it? Almost 300-year-old engraving. The average murder rate in states with the death penalty is 5.37 per 100,000 people. In states without the death penalty, it's 4.17. Now, one would think if the death penalty were a deterrent, those numbers would be flipped, but they're not. And in polls, there was an annual poll of police chiefs asking the most effective method of preventing violent crime, including homicide. In every poll, the death penalty was dead last in the poll of police chiefs, the people who know criminal justice the best and are most intimately involved in trying to prevent violent crime. The third is the danger of executing an innocent person. Since 1973, 200 people nationwide have been released from death row after having found that their conviction was not true, that they were in fact innocent. And later this evening, we'll hear about the story of one man here in Louisiana, told by his wife. So 12 of those death row exonerations have taken place here in Louisiana. And this really floors me. Since '76, there's a ratio of one innocent person freed from death row for every 8.2 executions. That is, if you just look straight at those numbers, that's an error rate of about 12% in capital homicide cases. Now, would you get on an airplane if 12% of them crashed? Or would you drive a car if 1 out of 12 would end up in a fatal accident? No. So why in heaven's name are we continuing with a system that is that bad? So these are just pictures of some of innocent men that were exonerated from Louisiana's death row. Now, why, in this modern society, with all the tools and resources at our disposal, are there so many wrongful convictions? Now, this is a rather old study, but I think the data is actually, very true today. The number one is eyewitness error, that people witness a crime, but the memory is a funny thing. Even if you talk to a friend about an event that happened a couple years ago, the odds are, if the two of you talk about it, you're going to find that you remember it differently. The memory is a very strange thing. 17 were active government misconduct in those cases. 10 was the use of snitch testimony that was false. 8 were false coerced confessions. And 9 were junk science, basically so-called forensic experts testifying wrongly. And then there were a bunch of others as well. With all the shows about CSI, you would think that everything is we know absolutely everything now about every crime, but it's balderdash. In fact, there's only DNA evidence in about 5 to 10% of criminal cases. that's an extraordinarily small number. And so in the vast majority of homicide cases, there is no DNA or biological evidence at all. So it is eyewitness testimony, it is circumstantial evidence, the whole range of other factors in criminal cases. The other is imperfect forensic analysis. People make mistakes. And then crime lab scandals. There was the FBI lab testified in hundreds of cases around the country saying that hair found at crime scenes could have only come from one person, the perpetrator. It was later found to be ridiculous. It wasn't the case. And so there was I think for about an 8-9 year period, the FBI went back over hundreds and hundreds of cases, trying to reopen those cases, saying we got it wrong. That testimony was false. And quite a few people were released from prison as a result of that. And one case in Virginia, there was a man who was convicted of a rape and murder solely on 2 pieces of evidence. One was changed testimony of a gate guard at a naval base who changed his testimony about the time of a sailor coming back to the base after undergoing hypnosis. The second was a forensic expert who testified that Keith Harward was the only human being on the planet who could have left the bite mark on the victim. And Keith Harward was lucky. He escaped the death penalty. He was first sentenced to death, but because of a quirk in the Virginia homicide law, that death sentence was overturned. Because in the case, a woman was raped and her husband was murdered. The way the law was written at the time, that the felony and the homicide had to be against the same victim. So he ended up with a life sentence instead and was in prison for over 30 years until DNA ultimately proved he wasn't the person who did the crime. But if that death sentence hadn't been overturned, Virginia would have executed him 30 years ago when we would have never known we had executed an innocent man. The last key argument, and this is one people don't think about, but it's the one I call collateral damage. People caught in the criminal justice system. This is a former death row guard in Georgia, and that he testified on behalf of a guy who'd been on death row in Georgia for many years, and basically saying this was not the man who carried out the crime 15 years before. And he thought it would be a terrible miscarriage of justice to execute him because he wasn't the same person after 15 years. And so there are jurors. There was one case in North Carolina. 11-year-old girl was raped and murdered in Robeson County. And after the 2 brothers were exonerated after 30 years, a number of jurors were interviewed. One elderly woman said, "I should have followed my conscience," her hand shaking. "I hope he can forgive me." Many were ashamed. Some feared God's wrath on them, and others shed tears and said it was too painful to even talk about. 30 years later, one juror said his biggest regret is that he trusted the prosecutors, that if these guys were on trial, they must have been guilty. And it's interesting, kind of going back, I once gave a talk in Northern Virginia at a church. And I was talking to a number of people afterwards, and the last person to come up to me was a tall gentleman, and he said, "I want to thank you and tell you a little bit. I was on the Moussaoui jury, the one man who was captured in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He was captured for an unrelated crime leading up to 9/11. And he was prosecuted as a terrorist and for multiple homicides. And so this man was on the jury, and he said Until that case, I supported the death penalty. But after going through what he called the most horrendous emotional and psychological manipulation by the prosecution, I couldn't bring myself to vote for execution because of the very twisted way in which the prosecution sought to prejudice the jury. And he was on one count, he was one of 2 votes to spare Moussaoi's life. And on the second count, he was the sole vote. So he saved Zacarias Moussaoi's life. This guy who was utterly unrepentant and at trial gloated about the success of the 9/11 attacks. And so I met with him subsequently, and he wrote anonymously his jury number, whatever his jury number was. He blogged a little bit about the case. And if you dig online, you can find it, some of his musings. And he talked about during the case, there was a large bowl of a Tylenol and acetaminophen. And he said jurors were constantly popping these things because they were just under so much pressure in that capital murder case. So jurors can be broken and traumatized by the system. 6 former executioners have publicly talked about the trauma that they've experienced. You know, just one sentence I want to bring about. Living with nightmares is something that we know from experience. No one has the right to ask a public servant to take on a lifelong sentence of nagging doubt and, for some of us, shame and guilt. Should our justice system be causing so much harm to so many people when there is an alternative? A number of these guys talk about they're visited in dreams by the people they've executed. So, talking about Virginia and how we abolished. How am I doing on time, Mark? Okay. So, again, we executed 113 in the modern era. We executed the highest percentage of those sentenced to death in the United States. We were also fastest in the nation from death sentence to execution, a little over 7 years in the modern era. So this is some of the folks at a board retreat, probably about close to 20 years ago. So distinct eras. In the bad old days, basically all we could do was public protest against a huge number of executions and to oppose efforts to add more and more crimes that would be eligible for the death penalty. Our first key victory was preserving the triggerman rule. In Virginia, if there were multiple people involved in a homicide, the only person who could be sentenced to death was the triggerman, the person who actually committed the homicide, not the accomplice. The only exception was murder for hire. And there was repeated attempts to overturn the triggerman rule, and we managed one year, just barely squeaked by 1 vote to override, to sustain a veto of a Democratic governor. And then eventually we were able to defeat expansion bills. And after the expansion bills gave up, no efforts to further expand the death penalty were introduced. And at that point, we discouraged our allies, don't bring up abolition bills because they're going to be laughed out of committee. We don't want to be a laughingstock in the legislature. We only want to bring abolition forward if we have a shot. And we need some time to organize the public support to do that. And in the interim, what we did is we worked 3 years on a bill to exempt people with severe mental illness from the death penalty. Now, the Supreme Court has said you can't execute a juvenile who commits a homicide, and you can't execute someone with an intellectual disability who commits a homicide. But you can execute a severely mentally ill human being, someone who's a paranoid schizophrenic, somebody who says God told him to kill this police officer because he was an agent of Satan and delusions. You can execute him as long as he understands causation, that what he did 10 years ago means he's being executed tomorrow. And if he doesn't understand that, he can be forcibly medicated and treated until he does understand the connection, and then you can execute him. Talk about Kafkaesque, but that is the case in the United States right now. So we were able to get good traction on the severe mental illness bill. It was an entree, because we could sit down with strong supporters of the death penalty and say, look, there are problems. Do you really want to execute somebody who's actively delusional? Is that going to serve the cause of justice? You could have a conversation. If I'd called, say, I wanted to talk to you about death penalty abolition, I'd had the phone hung up. But if I said I want to talk about this reform, modest reform, we could have a conversation. And over the course of several years, we developed relationships with supporters of the death penalty, and we began to sow doubt about the system. And over time, we actually had the bill pass the state Senate twice with second time with strong Republican support. Almost half the Republicans in the chamber supported the bill. So what made the difference? Capital defender offices. In the bad old days in Virginia, you'd get a court-appointed attorney who, in one case, got all of $625 to defend an indigent person of capital murder. And in many cases, these were young attorneys who may have never tried a felony before, being thrown into the deep water, being said to defend this indigent person from capital murder with minimal resources. What do you think happened? They lost, and there were death sentences handed down left and right. And we were able to get a reform through in the year, I think it was 2002, to provide funding. The whole indigent defense system in Virginia was on the verge of collapse. And the Virginia Supreme Court said, unless you change the system, we're going to have to rule it unconstitutional. So one of the recommendations was for capital murder, you have 4 regional centers: Eastern Virginia, Central Virginia, Northern Virginia, and Western Virginia. And you had a couple of top-notch attorneys trained at UVA Law School, William and Mary, Harvard, Yale, with former law enforcement doing investigations, and with top-notch social workers doing family background investigations. So suddenly, death sentences dropped 90% over the course of a handful of years. The blue line were the homicides in Virginia by year. The red line were the number of death sentences carried out. 2004 was the first year where capital defense offices, dramatic drop, and then from 2012 on, not a single death sentence. And I sweated out many cases. There were 2 cases of quadruple homicides and 2 cases of police murders. One, a young cop on her first day of work responding to a domestic case being shot and killed. Both cases, the jury opted, because of the mitigation work in the second trial phase, after guilt was established, to get a life sentence. And here are some of the remarkable attorneys that I just want to give a shout out to. And there are many more, but these are the ones I worked with probably the most closely. So just some remarkable, remarkable people who dedicated years and years and years of their life to capital defense work. Number 2, expanding staff capacity. Thanks to some successful fundraising, we doubled our staff from 1 to 2. Our coalition said our weak spot had always been we never had anyone who could devote their time to grassroots organizing in key parts of the state. So this guy on this picture, Dale Brumfield, we were able to hire to work full-time doing grassroots organizing for 4 years. First working in heavily Republican districts, speaking before any group that would have him, Rotary clubs, Knights of Columbus, churches, any place that he could, and slowly signing up hundreds over those time, conservatives, many Republicans, to our cause. And one of our biggest allies became the Virginia Association of Republican Women, became one of our biggest allies. Number 3, unusual allies. This is a picture of Jerry Givens. He executed 62 people in Virginia, first with the electric chair and then lethal injection. But he had a late conversion, and in his last 8-10 years of his life, he became an outspoken opponent of the death penalty. And he died in the early weeks of the pandemic. And even over a year later, during the death penalty abolition debate at the legislature, multiple people told about the tremendous impact Jerry's testimony had on them personally in their vote to end the death penalty. We had 21 murder victim family members publicly call for abolition, and we had many more victim family members who supported us, but were afraid to be public because of the hatred that would be unleashed on them by other family members. One of our starry young woman, Rachel Sutphin, ever since she came out to oppose the execution of the man who killed her father, neither her sister nor her mother will speak to her, and they'll send her kind of hate mail. So she's ostracized from her family because of the public position she took. And there are a lot of death row family murder victim family members who will not be public because of those kinds of very volatile emotions within their families. Again, the trauma, the deep trauma those families experienced because of homicide. And we had quite a few conservative leaders and a Republican co-patron of our bill to abolish the death penalty. And this is Rachel, and talked about how all the appeals that go through a capital trial forced her to relive the worst days of her life over and over and over again. And she said, the death penalty needs to be abolished in order to better care for the victim family members, to better serve the public good, and to protect human life. And these are some of the other murder victim families members in Virginia who are public and who had spoken publicly their opposition. And this is Keith Harward, the guy I talked to, who was vindicated because of DNA evidence, despite the bite mark analysis. And he wrote an op-ed supporting death penalty abolition because of his experience. And just a nice little story about Keith. He lives in a trailer now, and just he and his wife just travel wherever they want to, set up camp and stay there as long as they want. And so he lives his dream life now in his old age. This is a former Republican Attorney General who oversaw 36 executions, who publicly opposed the death penalty. And this is one of the most conservative Republicans in our legislature who was the co-patron of our abolition bill. And finally, reform prosecutors. We had a number of prosecutors who came out to support death penalty abolition. I think there were 15 of them, and altogether they represented over 40% of Virginia, because they represented the largest urban and suburban districts in the state. And then finally, racial justice reform. This picture is the Reverend Dr. Lakeisha Cook, who was our absolute, rock star, who organized hundreds of Black pastors and was really key in getting our governor to endorse death penalty abolition in his State of the Commonwealth address in January of 2021. And without him, I don't think we would have won if he hadn't have made that speech. And she had a key role in helping bring him over to make that public commitment. So, spiritual lessons. I'm Catholic, so I'm going to be referring to some Catholic spiritual heroes of mine. The first is the Reverend Helder Camara, who was Archbishop of Olinda and Recife in northeastern Brazil during the height of a vicious military dictatorship. It was a crime to publish his name in Brazil during that era, and that friends of his and anybody who would work with him were either tortured or murdered by that regime. But he wrote a very slim book of poetry, and the one that stood out to me is this simple one. If you disagree with me, if you have something to give me, if you disagree with me, you have something to give me. If you are sincere and seek the truth as best you may, honestly with modest care, your thought is a growth to mine, correction. You deepen my vision. And this is a man who suffered incredible repression and had the heart to do this. And I had the privilege of hearing him speak once, talk about a saint before he died. And so in listening, I learned some things. I learned that some Democrats strongly supported the death penalty. Some Republicans supported abolition. I learned to be strategic. One former Republican legislator told me that he once had a group of Democrats come to speak to him about a bill. And he sort of played with them, saying, all right, let's say I vote for your bill. Would any of you in this room vote for me in the next election? No. And he said, why would you bring a bunch of known Democrats into a room to advocate for me, a Republican? If they'd have done their job, they would have brought in 2 or 3 active Republicans. Then I would have had to listen, because these were my supporters. These are the people that donated to my campaign, that volunteered for my campaign. And so he taught me to be very strategic about who was the person to speak to a particular legislator. And this was a man who still supported the death penalty, who gave me that advice. So again, listening. One local Republican leader told me, he said he estimated no more than 10% of Republicans really care about the death penalty and strongly support it. Probably at 25% quietly oppose it, but don't want to get into a big fight with those who support it, and the rest really don't care one way or the other. Another Republican legislator told me in his 10 years in office, not a single person had written or called him in support of the death penalty. He never got a question about it at any of the town halls that he had. And I learned that there were great generational differences among Republicans and Democrats in the legislature. So, love your neighbors and listen to them is something I recommend to you. Many faith communities have diverse congregations. I'm probably by reputation as a liberal congregation, but you have some conservative members, and there are conservative congregations with liberal members. Almost every congregation may have a police officer, a prison guard, a prosecutor, a violent crime victim sitting in the pew somewhere. Talk to them, listen to them, ask what they think. Speak to them with the spirit of humility, listen to their views, don't debate them, and never assume anyone is for the death penalty. One lovely story, there's a group called the Virginia Civil Defense League that organizes an open carry day at the General Assembly, where everybody brings their AK-47s down to the General Assembly and saying, yeah, we ought have the right to carry our guns anywhere. I sat down and talked with him one time, just saying, what if he opposed the death penalty? Wouldn't that be a hoot? As it turned out, he was a law enforcement official who had had multiple instances where he thought the death penalty was administered wrongly when he was a cop in Georgia. And he said, you know, if I wasn't involved in this public position, I might join you in testifying against the death penalty. But because he was in this high-profile position, he felt he couldn't do that. Never assume. Be faithful whether your efforts work or not. This is Thomas Merton. He wrote a remarkable piece called Letter to a Young Activist. Do not depend on the hope of results. Focus on the value, the truth of the work. All the good that you will comes not from you, but from the fact that you have allowed yourself in the obedience of faith to be used by God's love. And he said, once you allow yourself to do that and to be that, you can open yourself up to great power. Stay humble about yourself and your role. This is Bishop Kenneth Untner, who wrote this piece. The kingdom of God is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future that is not our own. And then finally, there's a need for prayer and discipline. This is another hero of mine, Reverend Dan Berrigan, peace activist extraordinaire, anti-poverty activist, and pro-life activist. At a protest, I was asked if I was trying to change the world. I answered, I was trying to keep the world from changing me. And another time, there's an enormous moral difference between doing something and doing nothing. So those are the lessons I'd like to leave with you. Thanks.
Michael, thank you very, very much. When I was asking Michael, this conversation started back, in early March. We were saying earlier in the car ride over to the church this evening. It was before Lily was born, my 6-month-old baby. We were tracing that timeline out. But one of the first things Michael said, he said, I'm very happy to come and talk about Virginia and what worked and sort of how we got to where we did. He said, but of course, we need to hear from folks doing the work in Louisiana. He was very clear about that up front. And so with that, we were very fortunate to have Laverne and Allison come. Laverne, I'm going to invite you to come forward first. And if you would tell us a little bit about yourself and about your work that you have done and are doing, and then we will turn to Allison.
Good evening. This work started from my husband, who was exonerated in 2003. I've been advocating for the death penalty ever since then. So to tell you a little bit about my husband, my late husband, John Thompson. In 1985, he was arrested at the age of 22 for a crime that he didn't commit, and later became 2 crimes that he didn't commit, and he was ultimately exonerated from. John spent 18 years in prison, 14 years on death row, fighting for his life. 1999, after writing numerous attorneys, letting them know, trying to see if someone would take his case, saying that he was innocent, finally, some attorneys from Philadelphia, they stepped up and they heard him and they wanted to take the case on. And in 2003, he was exonerated. This, to me, this abolition work is very important because, like Michael said, they have a lot of guys that was ultimately exonerated from prison, from death row. But think about the guys that probably died innocently on death row, that didn't have anyone to fight for them they didn't believe them, they just took the prosecutor's word and executed them. My husband's story is a unique one, and I would like to continue telling his story and letting people know that the death penalty is wrong, because they have gotten it wrong. So that's all I have to say right now, because I'm getting kind of, this was the month that he passed away in October 2017, and I'm getting kind of emotional right now telling the story, but I'm willing to answer some questions if anybody have any. But one thing I would like to say right now, I received a fellowship from the Soros Open Society, and I'll be focusing on an archive, a community archive. Because like my husband, when my husband was released from prison, my husband did work that the state of Louisiana, the city of New Orleans wasn't doing. He was helping guys come home from prison, transition back into society, him and some other guys. They were educating guys on the right to vote, trying to find out, what their passion was, what they wanted to do in life, and giving them hope. So with that being said, he have an organization that I'm following up with, and it's now the John Thompson Legacy Center, but it was Resurrection After Exoneration. And just like Jesus was resurrected, he felt like he was resurrected, and he can help the other guys coming home resurrect as well. And the project that I'm doing is a community archive. So I feel like I like to call like my husband is like a hero. Like, he came home doing a lot of great work for the city, the community. And just to preserve the traces of the work that he did, and knowing what the legislator, the governor is trying to do, bring back the death penalty, bring back executing guys, people in prison. I would like to, just keep his story and other guys' stories alive. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Good evening, and thanks for having me here. Oh, it's not on the screen. Pastor Mark, it's not on the screen. Maybe he can help. Thank you all for having me here. I had a major hip surgery 2 weeks ago, and some of you knew that, and I felt like when I met with my doctor for my 2-week post-op follow-up on Thursday, it was like, he was like Jesus in Jerusalem telling the guy after 38 years, just get up and walk. And so Bill Quigley, who many of you know, had loaned me his wife's walker, and I had these crutches, and I just dropped them all, and I was like, I can walk. And when I asked the guys on death row, I messaged all of them through JPay, the email system, and I said, what do you want folks to know? St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans is doing this whole weekend and lecture series. And they said, well, just tell them to show up. So like me walking, you all got up and you came here tonight. And so I think just being able to do something. And when I see the faces of the guys on death row, I see the face of Jesus. And it is them saying, go and do something. And so last Sunday was World Day Against the Death Penalty in the Catholic Church. October is Respect Life Month. So around the world, people are talking about the death penalty. And we join them at this time to come together to work to end the death penalty, to end this carceral system that we're in. And so I want to honor the work of Michael Cahoon, who's here with Louisiana Repeal from the Promise of Justice, and Maureen Kelly, who works really close with Michael. And it's been 15 years since the state of Louisiana has executed anyone. And since the last execution here, the Louisiana legislature and Governor Jeff Landry have been trying to restart executions in our state in various ways. And this past year, after Governor Jeff Landry took office, there was a special session in the spring in which Representative Nick Muscarello passed House Bill 6. And House Bill 6 shrouded Louisiana's lethal injection process, making it a secret, making it easier for the state to obtain the lethal injection drugs against the wishes of pharmaceutical companies and others, and making claims for people on death row to argue that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. So it made it harder to bring those claims. It also added 2 methods to how the state of Louisiana can execute people, bringing back the electric chair and also nitrogen hypoxia or gassing. And so House Bill 6 was rushed and passed through this special legislative session and signed by Governor Landry. And we have amazing attorneys in the state who have been challenging the lethal injection process through litigation. And this litigation has been helping stay executions for many years in our state, but now it's re-threatened by this new House Bill 6 that got passed. And so as we approach nearly 15 years without any executions and this dark cloud hanging over the state of Louisiana, we are now in a place where executions could easily resume. And so, as you heard from Michael Stone, the death penalty has been shown ineffective in making communities safe or preventing any violence. And so we've been doing a lot of organizing over the past year, knowing that Jeff Landry named in his campaign many times that he was going to work to support the death penalty. So a little bit of how I got involved in this work. My dad was incarcerated in Georgia. When he came home, he died of suicide within a week. And then I saw how the system of policing and prosecution in prisons didn't help families heal. It didn't change my dad. It didn't help our family heal. And so when I came back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, I was looking for work. I worked briefly at Creole Creamery. I was not good at scooping ice cream. The Capital Post-Conviction Project of Louisiana was looking for a paralegal, and I just needed different work. So I started as a paralegal on these cases. My first week there, Carol Kolenchek, one of the death penalty attorneys in town, told me to go to this sandwich shop. And it was Laverne Thompson and John Thompson's sandwich shop. And it was really JT, or John Thompson, who really encouraged me to become an attorney. And the guys on death row said, Allison, we need lawyers who love us. Like, are you just going to stay a paralegal, or are you going to go to law school? And so then I started studying for the LSAT and became a lawyer. While I was in law school, I started the process of becoming a Catholic nun. And then after I became a Catholic sister, some of the sisters who were serving as spiritual advisors on death row had passed, and one of the guys that they were visiting was Chris Sepulvedo, and he was scheduled for an execution on Ash Wednesday in 2013. And since Sister Pat had passed and had been accompanying him for years, he said, Allison, will you accompany me? I was up there for almost 12 hours a day at Angola, 3 hours from here, for the 2 weeks leading up to his scheduled execution date. We were able to get a last-minute stay of execution because the government, the state of Louisiana, had obtained the drugs illegally to execute him. So we prepared for a death that never happened. And so that's kind of been my journey. Since then, I've organized spiritual advisors with Jeff Landry taking office and knowing that most of the guys on death row have never had a visitor, and most of them do not have spiritual advisors. I've found 24 spiritual directors. Reverend Caroline Durham is one of them, who said yes to the invitation to serve as a spiritual advisor on death row. So I've been serving as a spiritual advisor for more than a decade, visiting the guys for 19 years now. And A spiritual advisor is the only one in the execution chamber when an execution takes place. We accompany them spiritually, emotionally, psychologically to prepare them as best as one can for execution by our government. We also walk with their families, their children, their grandchildren, sometimes the victim's family, if that feels appropriate, though our legislature recently passed a law saying that we can be criminalized and serve time and pay fines if we reach out to crime victims now. And so that makes it hard when people say, well, have you contacted the victim's family? How are you supporting them? We now cannot legally do that. So I'm going to share a little bit about our work. Recently, well, with Jeff Landry taking office after the election last year, and in support of the clemency petition, so some very wise lawyers said, let's try, while we have Governor John Bel Edwards, who is a pro-life Catholic and against the death penalty in office, let's try to file clemency petitions to the pardon board for everyone on death row en masse all together and see if we can, get life sentences for these guys. It wasn't to get them out of Angola, it was to give them life sentences. And so having faith leaders speak up is really, really important. Having your voices speak up, people in the pews, that's who the legislators ask for. That's who the bishops ask for. That's who they tell us we need to organize. And so we started a group called LIFE, Louisiana Interfaith Against Executions, as a step towards that. I said earlier that when I see the guys on death row, when I see their faces, I see the face of Jesus, and I think it's important to see their faces. And so I have some pictures here to show you. This is, I guess it's to the right of me, there's John Thompson, Laverne's husband. This was when we were, before we were going back up to Angola. Mr. Chopin here was going to see his son. Fox Rich was seeing her husband, Rob Rich, at Angola, and we would all carpool and ride up together. So even after JT came home, he still had the courage to be able to go back to death row to visit his friends and to give them hope and to let them know he wasn't alone, that they weren't alone. Oh no, this is John Thompson and Andrea Armstrong. This is when we were trying to pass an act around compensation around the case of Glenn Ford. John Thompson did more than 18 years on death row for a murder he didn't do. Glenn Ford did 30 years on death row for a murder he didn't do. And I had the privilege of living with Glenn Ford and being one of his caretakers on a team with JT at a resurrection after exoneration house until he passed. When he came home after being exonerated, he was diagnosed with cancer and needed treatment, and we had to raise a lot of money every week for his medical care. And we were fighting for compensation for wrongful convictions. This is John Thompson and Sister Lori Schaff. Sister Lori Schaff founded Hope House in the old St. Thomas housing development, if any of you remember that. The house that Sister Lori founded is where Sister Helen Prejean first started her ministry against the death penalty and started working there, and where a lot of our movement elders like Bill Quigley had started his ministry and work too. This was Sister Pat, who has deceased, who's accompanied Chris Sepulvedo. He's also known as Shorty. He's getting shorter. Chris is now 80 years old and is a great-grandfather and is now in a wheelchair and is one who is at the end of all of his appeals. These are some of the guys on death row and their family members during our contact visit. Sometimes lawyering can look very different than being in a courtroom, such as advocating for someone to get an emotional support dog into Angola. We've been organizing prayer vigils. Kind of what Michael said was kind of the first step in Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, so organizing a lot of protest and prayer vigils. And this was one that Michael and others had organized at the John Thompson Legacy Center with some of our local faith leaders, and our prayer vigil outside of the governor's mansion when Governor John Bel Edwards was willing to meet with us about the clemency petitions, yet failed to have the moral courage and political will to really support and demand that his pardon board give hearings on those clemency petitions. But we tried our best. This was meeting with Governor John Bel Edwards and First Lady Donna Edwards at the governor's mansion, with the Catholic bishops and other faith leaders here. And while it was a great meeting, again, he didn't have the political will to do it in the way that we hoped before Jeff Landry took office. This is our friend Michael Cahoon, who's here. And so as Christians, we're called to, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And Michael and I, and be willing to go to the places that make us uncomfortable. And so Michael and I went to Lafayette to the pro-life march. And we're there to talk to people about the death penalty while everyone else was there to talk about anti-choice. And so it's going to these places that may be uncomfortable and the unlikely allies, as Michael talked about. And who are we talking to? Who are the people who may be on our side we just haven't talked to? And everyone we talked to there was very in support of abolishing the death penalty or willing to write their legislators about it. So these are some of our press conferences at the Capitol, holding prayer vigils to try to stop bad bills from going through. Sometimes we win some, sometimes we don't. Here's Reverend Caroline Durham from here. And we invite you to join us. And if you're not already getting emails from Life, Louisiana Interfaith Against Executions, would love to add you to the email list to join us in those. And this is again just some pictures as spiritual advisor to some of the guys on the row. This is the group of our spiritual directors. Many are from other states who are flying here to drive 3 hours up to Angola to accompany them and meet weekly with the person that we've matched them with. And we try to match them according to their preference for race and gender and religious tradition. And this is Chris again. I think that's all I have open to questions. And so maybe Michael and Laverne, maybe we can sit here, and if folks have questions, if you have your index cards. Reverend Mark, are you going to collect the cards? Okay, great.
To continue conversation, we have some refreshments in the back, but we'll do about 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. So. Yeah, if y'all will help. I've got a question to start us off with for Laverne and for Allison, and either of you can address this. For folks like us, what are some things? This is the inevitable question. What are things that we can do? But I mean it. What are ways to support the work that is close to your hearts and that you are leading right now? I used to be a nonprofit leader. I used to get that question all the time, and sometimes it's financial support. Sometimes it's showing up. Sometimes it's learning how to engage or not. So anyway, I'm very curious to hear your answers. And Laverne, I'll pass it off to you first, and you can choose to do what you will.
So one, join us in prayer. As you came in and as you exit, there are some prayer cards. One of them is one that I had written and put together, and one is from Sister Helen. So I invite you to join us in prayer. Make it a daily or weekly practice, especially if and when executions are ever scheduled. Join Louisiana Repeal. Michael Cahoon. Michael, can you raise your hand or stand up? So you can talk to Michael about ways to get involved in Louisiana Repeal. I'm going to pass around this sheet here that asks for name, phone number, email address, and your faith community. If you would like to get on the email list for Louisiana Interfaith Against Executions, I really only send like maybe 5 or 6 emails a year. So it's very low volume. If an execution comes up, there may be a little more frequency, but it's a very low volume to keep you informed. I try to stay thorough. So Catherine, can you take those and pass them around? Yes, here's a pen. Thank you. Thanks. Maybe a couple pins. Yeah, so following up with life, LA repeal, talking to your representative and letting them know where you stand on this, especially when the session comes up. We don't know what bills will be going forth in the next session. Michael is very good at keeping us updated with what's happening, and your voice really matters, calling your representative really matters, supporting them so they can have the moral courage and political will to speak up and to talk to their colleagues about it. You know, as Michael Stone said, a lot of them don't get calls in support of the death penalty, but we need to make our voices heard to say, you know, we're against this, and not allowing the killing of human beings to be used as a political tool for people to be elected or to appear tough on crime.
As Allison said, reaching out to you know, your representatives, speaking out against the death penalty. And one of the things I would say, we're still in the rebuilding stages at the John Thompson Legacy Center. We have different events going on over there, movies, documentaries about the death penalty. So we have a calendar that you can look at, you know, that you have some dates where we have different events, and you definitely welcome to come and get involved and see what's going on. Thank you.
Also, 2 other things. One, I do have a nonprofit called Mission Mycelium. If you have resources and would like to donate to support faith organizing in Louisiana against capital punishment and mass incarceration, you can make tax-deductible donations, especially as the end of the year comes around. So happy to give you that information. And we are working to organize Christmas presents for all the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those on death row so that they get a Christmas present from their dad. And so if you would like to be part of that, your donation can go towards that, and we're organizing that work.
This next question, Michael, I'm going to let you start this one off. Someone just asked to speak a bit more about the ways that sheriffs, DAs, police chiefs specifically were engaged over the years.
Yeah, in Virginia, that was a very tough nut to crack. Some states have good luck in organizing law enforcement, and law enforcement in the broadest sense. They could be prison guards, former wardens, former beat cops, prosecutors, assistant prosecutors. In Virginia, we had a group called, one of our partners was Justice Forward Virginia, that worked on criminal justice reform in a number of ways, including the end of capital punishment. And they basically helped organize the newer prosecutors who were being elected that were more progressive in their orientation, and basically helped gather them together and kind of gave them the courage to together take stands that maybe they would have been afraid to do individually. So that, you know, it's one thing to go out on a limb as a sole prosecutor to say, you know, I want to see an end to the death penalty, but if I'm one of 15, that, you know, you have the, it's like you don't like going out to a movie by yourself. You like to have a friend with you, you know. But being public or something, so that was a very big thing that Justice Forward Virginia helped with us, and they were really the only kind of part of that spectrum of law enforcement we were able to organize, other than Jerry Givens, as a former executioner, who was very, very powerful. But he had passed away the year before the abolition campaign, so his voice wasn't there to get us over the finish line. but these other prosecutors were. And their big role was really in sidelining VACA, the Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys. Their lobbying group really was the nemesis against any criminal justice reform effort in the state. They were always up there lying through their teeth about how if this modest reform would happen, criminals would run wild in the street and all the prison doors would open. And so sidelining them because we had 10 VACA members, 12, 15 VACA members saying we oppose the death penalty, they had to be neutral. So just sidelining them was a huge difference in committee in particular.
Michael Cahoon, I'm going to put you on the spot because I heard your name mentioned in association with this a minute ago. There's a question that says, are there any plans for legislative efforts in the 2025 upcoming legislation or legislative session in the upcoming year? And I can hand you the mic if, yeah.
So in the upcoming year, right now, in 2025, the Louisiana legislature, we have a part-time legislature. They only meet about 10 weeks a year. So they meet starting in April of 2025. It's a limited bill number year, which means they're limited to only 5 bills per legislator because it's odd number years. And in odd number years in Louisiana, you only get 5 bills because they have to work on the budget. So we're talking with legislators right now and certainly invite people to join those conversations about what sort of bill we can push this session. And I think taking a sort of a page from Michael and Virginia's, it might look different. We've done full repeal bills 6 of the last 7 years. I think this year we will look at the severe mental illness issue and maybe do a bill around that. Or we might do something around the expanded methods of execution, trying to go after the electric chair and the gassing that they had just brought back. So that's where we are now, but it's still very much in the early stages of conversations, and we welcome people to get involved in those. So
I'm trying to get to as many questions as we can in the next couple of minutes. Laverne, I'm going to pass this one over to you. This was from Zoom. They said, could you speak to or give some advice about what family and loved ones of those on death row might do to help?
I would say by supporting other family members, going to group sessions. One of the organizations that me and my husband was involved with when he was first released was this organization called Witness to Innocence. And Witness to Innocence focused on people that was on death row and that was, ultimately exonerated. And they not only focused on the death row exonerees, they focused on the families. So we would get together and we would talk and, find out how each one of us was dealing with the situation, what our needs were, and how we could support the other family members whatever their need was. So I would say have a support group or something that you can reach out to be involved with.
Yeah. We also host, if and when executions are scheduled, having support circles for family members of loved ones via Zoom because they're all over the state. Some are in other states. So just having that regular support on a weekly basis to gather.
Yeah, just one thing that we did, probably one of the public enemy number ones who were on our death row, who was ultimately executed, was a man named Ricky Gray. And he carried out a quadruple homicide about 10 blocks from where my wife and I currently live. as he, in the week before his execution, he had family members from out of state who wanted to spend time with him before he was killed. And we got a call saying, can you help us raise some money? And so one of our key pastors who had been involved in the work got some money from his parish budget, and he paid for a hotel room just out, very close to the prison, so that these out-of-state family members could spend as much time with Ricky in his last week. So, I think we need to support the family members, those on death row. I mean, I'm just humbled that they would ask how they can help, when I think all of us should be involved in helping to support them, because they are dealing with, a very, very tough situation. And so anyway, I just would want to mention that we need to support them as well.
Okay, one last question, final question for the night. The question was, should we be alarmed about the use of gas as a method of execution? I'm going to say yes. Yes, we should. Yes, we should. Allison, are you up to date by chance? I think there have been some efforts to organize amongst Jewish citizens here in the state. Could you speak just briefly to that? Yeah.
Yeah, so some friends in our Jewish community had organized Jews Against Gassing to try to, get that removed from House Bill 6. It did not. It was not successful in doing that, but I hope they continue to do that work and being able to tell their stories for how it impacts them as Jewish people or people of Jewish heritage, and remembering what happened during the Holocaust and how gassing chambers were used then.
Just one note, I just want to think it's important to say that there's no good or humane way to kill another human being. And that, and I'd sort of say, while, it's good to, especially with the history of gas, but I think as part of the messaging is that there's no good way to execute another human being. We shouldn't be doing it. And actually, VADP had a position that that we basically, wouldn't favor any method over another, just saying they were all equally bad and should all be done away with.
Everybody, thank y'all so very much. A round of applause for our panel. A couple of closing notes of a pastor. I can't help myself. A couple of preaching moments. One, does this type of thing matter? Well, yeah, of course it does. Yes, absolutely. Also, would raise up in Texas just a few nights ago. Robert Robinson, I believe, is, yes, forgive me if his last name's slightly off, received a stay of execution on the day of the evening of his scheduled execution. It always matters, yes, these types of things that we do. Laverne, the work that you and John and so many others did on the time, the 18 years that he was on death row, of any life that can be saved. St. Charles, you'll know I preached a sermon about that last week. And Ricky Gray was a gentleman that I didn't mention him by name in the sermon, but Ricky was someone that I had corresponded with by connections from being on the board of VADP. So yes, indeed. Also, Brendan Lyman, this is an in-house for St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church. Brendan and his spouse now live not far from Michael on the south side of Richmond, Virginia. Brendan contacted me and said that they are gathering a group of progressive prosecutors in New Orleans from across the country in early December. And they plan to be here. I think Brendan might stop by as well. But he and his organization, I'll not remember its name right now, but very fair and just prosecution. They gather prosecutors from around progressive prosecutors from around the country, and they're meeting in New Orleans in a couple of months. Also want to lift up Caroline Durham and the Center for Faith in Action. And it is now dark outside, but the solitary garden that is being installed and is almost there is Basically done. Excellent. Fantastic. If you're back tomorrow, when the sun is out, feel free to stop by and look at that. There's informational sheets already and in the back as well. Caroline and the center also are a storehouse of information for partner organizations across the city that are doing the types of things that were mentioned and lifted up earlier. And lastly, I would just say thank you. Thank you to Danny Calhoun, who's quietly sitting in the back, who's prepared some refreshments that we can enjoy on our way out. And you can also linger a bit. I know I didn't get to all the questions, but if Allison, Laverne, and Michael, they'll be back in the back for a few minutes, and you'll have a chance to talk to them. Allison will be back, and Michael as well in the morning. Allison will be preaching, and so come and enjoy a sermon from Allison. We're glad you're going to be here. And with that, I would say thank you all for coming. Let us continue on in the work. Thank you.